Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the store's event director, and Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years in business. We credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone, so thank you all for spending this evening with us. I'm very thrilled today to be collaborating once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome Nicholas Delbanco and Susan Cheever for the release of E. Cummings' novel, The Enormous Room, which is out now from NYRB Classics with Nicholas's introduction. Now, some housekeeping before I properly introduce our guests. We've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, click on the live transcription button on the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, you can click on the Q&A button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. We'll be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that could arise and we try to resolve them very quickly. We've got some very exciting virtual events coming up for you at Community Bookstore this summer, so head to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One in particular is on Thursday, August 18th. We're thrilled to welcome Vivek Narayanan for his collection After, which is out now from NYRB Poets. He will be in conversation with Aditya Bal, and that program is up on our website now and taking registrations. So now, a little about tonight's guests, and we will get started. Nicholas Delbanco is the author of more than 30 books of fiction and nonfiction, including most recently Why Writing Matters, the essay collection Curiouser and Curiouser, and the novel It Is Enough. He is the Robert Frost Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan. He lives in New York City and Cape Cod, which is where he's joining us from tonight. And Susan Cheever is an acclaimed best-selling author whose 16 published books and dozens of essays have built on the brilliant legacy of her father, the novelist and short story writer John Cheever, whose stories will be the subject of her upcoming book, When All the Men Wore Hats. She has published 5 novels, 5 memoirs, and 3 additional biographies, including the best-selling American Bloomsbury, and My Name is Bill, which is Bill Wilson, His Life and the Creation of Alcoholics Anonymous. Her book about American history as seen through the lens of alcoholism, drinking in America, Our Secret History, was published in 2015 and longlisted for the PEN John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. Her biography of E. Cummings was published in February of 2014. She has also taught at Yale, Sarah Lawrence, Brown University, and the New School, and Bennington. So without any further ado, I will hand it off to you. Nick, Susan, thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Very glad to be here and to be part of this party. Am I being seen and heard? I just want to make sure of that. Yes. Well, on we go. I'm going to speak first because I'm the introducer, or what they call in show business next to closing, which is to say the main act is my old friend and constant colleague, Susan Cheever, because she wrote a first-rate biography of E. Cummings, which is at least adjacent to the text that we're going to be talking about this evening, and some of which I hope she will paraphrase as we go on. But I'm the one who introduced The Enormous Room and persuaded, though it didn't take much persuading, New York Review Books to reissue it. As it happens, we had that discussion and declared that intention several years ago. And Edwin Frank, the editor of the show, said, look, in 2022, it's going to be 100 years old, which is a bit paradoxical feeling, if not seeming, because the book is so manifestly youthful and kind of exuberantly young that to think of it as a centenarian's text is to come up short. Nonetheless, 100 years ago, this novel, The Enormous Room, which is the only novel that Cummings, I don't mean novel, sorry, this memoir, this nonfiction text, which is the only extended work of prose fiction that he produced. He also published a series of lectures called I-6 Non-Lectures, which were a series of talks he gave at Harvard. But he is, of course, principally known as a poet. It's on that his reputation rests. And indeed, I would guess that 90 out of 100 people who know the work of E.E. Cummings do not know that the first thing he published of any substance is this remarkable small book, The Enormous Room, about which we will speak at some length. But speaking of introductions, which has just come to a close, I would like to ask Susan if she would tell us about the personal rather than the public encounter with Cummings that she was privileged to have when young. Over and out.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, I'm so thrilled to be here to talk about E.E. Cummings. He really has been a guiding spirit in my life, beginning with his friendship with my father. And when I was a little girl, I was always hearing stories from my father about E.E. Cummings and how when my father was in the army, for instance, E.E. Cummings wrote him a letter that said, "I too have slept with someone's boot in the corner of my smile," right? So my father spun this character of E.E. Cummings as an astonishingly buoyant, humorous man. And of course, that's what you see in The Enormous Room. You know, you send him to a concentration camp, he loves the concentration camp, right? You send him to war, he makes friends with the wrong side. He makes friends with the French, to be fair. But so I sort of knew about him. And then when I was, I guess, 14, as a teenager, I ended up being sent to a really dreadful school. So now I can't name it, but it was a very bad school for me. And I was a very bad student for them. And it was sort of 3 years of hell for all of us. And every time I complained about the school to my parents, they would say to me, well, you know, maybe if you lost weight, you'd do better, or maybe if your grades were better, you'd do better. Or, you know, they couldn't see what was happening to me at that school for whatever reasons. And one night it was announced at the morning assembly that E.E. Cummings was going to come and speak at the school. And so I was like, okay. So I went home and I said to my father, you know, E.E. Cummings is speaking at school tonight. And Cummings at that point was making a living doing lectures, which he did so brilliantly. I mean, he would time them down to the second, right? Anyway, I said to my father, you know, Cummings is going to read at school tonight. So my father said, okay, well, we'll go. So we go down to school and we walk into the headmaster's office, which is an office that I have only been in, you know, in disgrace. I've been in a lot in disgrace. And this voice goes, Joey, which was my father's nickname. And these two men just fell into each other's arms weeping. And, you know, they loved each other. And of course, Cummings, unbeknownst to me, had a horrible trip out from New York in an English teacher's sports car with his knees up around his ears, which he later described in a very hilarious way. Anyway, Cummings read, it was great, and then we drove him home. And that trip from where the school was to Cummings's house in Patchen Place in Greenwich Village really changed my life. And here's why. Cummings turned around, he was in the passenger seat, and he said to me, so how do you like that school? And I said, I hate it. And he said, of course you hate it. Anybody alive would hate that school. That school is nothing more than a hatchery to turn out obedient wives for moronic bankers. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You're right. And he went on like that. And he asked me questions and he listened to my answers, but he got what was wrong with the school. He said, they probably make you try to sit still for an hour. How did you know? How did you know? And so he rants on and on about the school and the teachers who he's met. And, you know, he just read there, right? So he has a little sense of what it's really like. And he said to me, you know, the only important thing is liberty. And schools like that don't even understand that. He said, you're a young woman, you're alive, your life is ahead of you. And here was the thing, not only did it change my view of the world, not only did it affirm my deepest and turns out to be pretty good desires, but at the time they seemed evil desires to be free, to do what I wanted, to just, you know, curl up in a corner and read. But my father, who had never listened to my complaints about this school, all of a sudden heard these complaints about the school. And he heard E.E. Cummings, who he revered, say to me, oh my God, of course you hate this school. So I actually, a year later, was allowed to leave that school and go to a school, the Woodstock Country School, that I loved. So it really changed my life. I fell in love with alternative education. I'm still teaching at Bennington. And, you know, it changed everything for me. And that spirit that Cummings had of buoyancy, of being alive, of taking whatever adversity you threw at him and making it into an advantage was something that just flipped me right over. And I've never forgotten that night. We stopped at White Castle for a hamburger. My father had a flask, of course. And that's why I wrote the biography. One of the few privileges of being a biographer is you can sometimes pay people back. I think revenge can be a very good motivation for writing a book, but gratitude can also be a very good motivation for writing a book. And I certainly owe Cummings, and it was a thrill to write his biography. So to link this back to The Enormous Room, I see that spirit so much in The Enormous Room. And as you know, the history of the writing of The Enormous Room was very weird. Cummings was also an artist. You've written about this beautifully, by the way. And so when he went to look at his notebooks, all he had were sketches. He hadn't really taken a lot of notes. So he had to commandeer Slater Brown, who was in the concentration camp with him, in the prison with him. And the two young men spent a summer on Silver Lake, kind of canoeing at night, I guess, or I don't know how they did it, but you know, cudgeling each other's memories for details. And that's how Cummings put together enough to write the book. But to my mind, the book is just suffused with that Cummings spirit, you know, that, you know, somebody's boot in the corner of my smile, right? No, nothing is going to keep me from enjoying my time on Earth. And here's how I'm going to do it. So I am so grateful for his existence and for the fact that our paths crossed on that amazing night.
I want to bring this into a somewhat more general context to begin with and talk about sort of the surround of this particular effort of his, because it does seem to me, though it is an authentically original and almost a sui generis sort of text, that it also belongs to a tradition. In fact, that's the reason I first encountered The Enormous Room, God knows how many years ago, but I was reading, as many of us did, the American accounts of the First World War, probably most famously Ernest Hemingway's novel called A Farewell to Arms, which is a loosely reportorial and a largely fictional, but you know, an important representation of what it meant to be a member of the ambulance corps in that war. There's a slightly less well-known book with the same context by John Dos Passos. There are many such, in fact, American volunteers who went over to enter the arena. And the war was fought more formally, in a certain sense, by the English, who were closer combatants, who didn't have to cross the Atlantic, but only the Channel to get involved, and many of them killed. Famously, the poets, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, many others, Robert Graves, wrote about the war. It's engendered, and the Germans too, Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, engendered, for reasons I'm not entirely sure of, but that remain interesting to me, a very large and excellent literature in a way that I'm not certain any war since or before has quite done. I mean, you can say this is the literature of the First World War and find a shelf of consequential texts. There are, of course, important books about the Second World War, about the Korean War, about the Vietnamese War in Vietnam, et cetera, but there's a real body of literature. In that body of literature, this is a peculiar and separate and remarkably invigorating sort of alternative, because as we all know, most war narratives are about stiff upper lips and grim consequence and sorrow. And as Susan has said, this is just an exuberant book. She mentioned Slater Brown, who was Cummings's companion on this adventure. They met on board the ship going to France from New York. William Slater Brown was also, if anything, more of a patrician presence than Cummings. Cummings came from a consequential Cambridge family, but Brown's family had founded the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. But he was even wackier and even more of a happy-go-lucky drunk. He got involved with Cummings in some madcap antics that the book glancingly reports on. Anyway, they got imprisoned together. The reason I mention this is in part because he's B in the book for Brown. Cummings, of course, is already only C. And the two of them kick up their collective heels. It's pretty clear, though Cummings doesn't talk about it much, that because of his father's contacts, he worked closely with Woodrow Wilson, et cetera, and he was an important public presence. He could have gotten sprung a little bit the way John McCain could have gotten sprung from prison camp in Vietnam. But Cummings never dreamed of so doing until and unless Brown could go with him. And he said, no way. And he also happened to enjoy himself a lot and kind of prefer it to the alternative. Paradoxically, in fact, the several months that they spent in jail saved their lives, or at least statistically made it less likely that they would be killed. They were deprived of certain pleasures and benefits and et cetera, but they weren't shot. Anyway, as it happens, Slater Brown, who was, as I say, a world-class drunk, got, and this relates to your book also, Susan, went completely stone cold sober for the last 50 years of his life, died at just about 100. And as it happens, his daughter, who's pushing 90 now, I'd say, is a neighbor of mine in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, from where I'm talking to you. And I spoke to her, of course, about the genesis of this book, the two of them up in Cummings's family house for the summer, trying to remember what had happened and writing it down when they weren't fishing and sailing and disporting themselves in their tent. And she said something that stayed very much with me. She said, you get the feeling that this was written by boys. Now, this is an octogenarian saying so, and she had proper perspective, but I think that's a deeply accurate sense. The book is wildly exuberant. And that's the second thing I want to say, and then I will subside into a seemly silence. There's a large history also of, is something going wrong?
Sorry, a call came in and I couldn't get, sorry.
It's fine. I'm still audible and visible, more or less?
Yes,
okay.
you are.
There's a large and honorable and indeed extremely powerful literature of prison texts. Now we can move from wartime texts to texts of incarceration. To my knowledge, the earliest is Boethius, several centuries before Christ writing the Consolations of Philosophy, but they're famous examples all through history. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote in jail. Eldridge Cleaver wrote Soul on Ice in jail. Jean Genet, et cetera, almost without exception, those books, Oscar Wilde, imprisoned, out of which came The Ballad of Reading Jail, but a beautiful autobiographical book called De Profundis Clamavi, out of the depths I cry. These books too are almost without exception grim, serious, constrained, furious. And this is about the only book I've ever read by an imprisoned man that's just full of hijinks and hilarity. He really enjoyed himself, it would seem. End of generality, beginning of specificities. Do you want to say anything in particular that struck you about this book?
Well, exactly what you're saying. He writes a letter to his mother that says, "You can't imagine what an interesting time I'm having, mother mine. Not for anything in the world would I change it." He's in a concentration camp, right? So thank you for connecting this to the literature of World War I. That was one of the stunning things for me, was that I actually had walked the World War I battlefields and read Robert Graves and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and gone to see where that had happened and walked the Baum Road. And it took me a ridiculous amount of time to realize that Cummings and Brown were sort of right there, and that because they were incarcerated, they probably weren't murdered like the other, whatever it was, 50,000 Americans who were killed on the Western Front. But it's so extraordinary that there they were while this unbelievable battle was sort of going on around them or just to the east of them. But
we should explain. Forgive my interrupting you, but I think this incarceration is worth explaining insofar as it is explicable. They traveled on a French ship to Paris or to Le Havre, and Cummings complained about it endlessly and probably correctly about how bad the food was, how poor the navigation was, how incompetent the French seemed, and he wrote home, sort of, saying, the French are really no good at this. And as it happens, they also met a few Germans whom they happened to like, probably as drinking buddies. And he said also, not all the Germans are all bad, which is a young man's accurate assessment of those who haven't yet, tried to shoot each other. And the French intercepted some of his letters home and decided that he was a spy, that he was a German sympathizer at the very least, and that he was reporting on their incompetence, because the first weeks, basically all they did was get to wash the ambulances. They didn't get to drive them. And because the French were very avid at that moment to get America to join the war, they didn't want any of this to come back. Therefore, they basically arrested Cummings and Brown and put them in a place called Fers Marté, which was a holding pen, a little short of a concentration camp and full-fledged jail, but enough so that they couldn't leave and had to sleep in, guarded dorms. So they got thrown in there essentially just out of a bureaucratic error. And a lot of the early part of this account is about the insane French bureaucracy, which, having lived in France, I can attest to. It's still there. Doesn't mean you have to be a German sympathizer in order to detest French bureaucracy, but these people did. Okay, sorry, I interrupted.
So to be fair, Cummings and Brown, especially Cummings, they were young men, on the rampage. Cummings had just exploded out of Harvard like a bullet out of a gun. And for instance, when he got in a fight with his commander, he took a big inhale of his cigarette and blew the smoke in the commander's face. I mean, this is not so, eventually then the commander insisted that they wash his car. I mean, there was both superficial insubordination and real insubordination in those letters on the part of both Cummings and Brown. But yeah, and he says that he thinks in the end almost everybody who was there by mistake, And that's kind of one of the amazing things. The other thing that I wanted to point to or talk about, in as much as I'm qualified to talk about it, is that this is one of the seminal documents of modernism, right? And so, I mean, we've got, everything comes together in this book. So we've got prison writing, we've got World War I writing, and we've got modernism, in the way that it's meant to happen. And, I went online earlier, and there's sort of the 5 tenets of modernism are, the 3 tenets of modernism are, the 20 tenets of modernism. But to my mind, right, modernism, and certainly it was something that Cummings really loved and hoped to embrace. It's anti-authoritarian. It does not lean on the past. But there are other things about modernism that I think the book really embodies. One is the idea that meaning can come through sound instead of sense. And Cummings was very involved with that. There's so many paragraphs in the book, a couple of which you quoted, where it's the sound of the paragraph. It's the sound of the voices in the big room, rather than him saying to you, there were a lot of people in this big room, right? That gives you a sense of what's really happening there. And especially the opening scene where he's taken into this huge room, and he doesn't know how big the room is because it's dark. Right. So he's taken into this huge room, and he's given his little his bed and told to go to sleep. And he has no idea if the room is 10 feet wide or 2 miles wide. Right. Because it's dark. And so that whole thing of the importance of sound, I think, is tremendously important. But the other thing, and I don't know if we should talk about this, but I'm going to bring it up. And then if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, is that I think one of the tenets of modernism that is the most interesting is the idea that the reader should have to work for it. In other words, it isn't, a lot of things have happened in the literary world since then. One of them has been the complete conflation of the art with the artist, but another one has been this complete sellout to the reader, right? The idea that if the reader has to break a sweat, there's something wrong. And Cummings believed very strongly, and in the best of his poems do this too, that you had to work and work and work, and then there would be an explosion of comprehension and surprise. And that was Amy Lowell's belief. Was the modernist idea that the payoff would be greater because you had to do some work to get to it. And I see that very much in The Enormous Room. And I kind of imagine Slater Brown in the tent saying, come on, let's just talk about the girls. And Cummings saying, no, first we're going to talk about the buckets. But I think, as well as being a brilliant example of incarceration literature and World War I literature, it's also a brilliant example of modernist literature.
Let me pick up on that by way of agreement. The world knows Cummings principally, indeed, almost only as a poet, but he wanted to be a painter. Very early on, that was his principal occupation, and it was his preoccupation while incarcerate. He did any number of sketches, and in the original edition of The Enormous Room, there are 30 or 40 sort of drawings. Frankly, I think he made the right choice. His gift of language was greater than of representational art, but he was reporting this visually and recording it visually. And as you said a little while ago, they reconstructed it after the fact and on the basis of the drawings. So the book is visual at least as much as verbal. And the tenet of modernism that he here embraced has a lot to do with, I don't want to sound over sonorous about this, but the word is sonority. If I say whoopee, I would spell it the way we tend to spell it, with its 7 sequential letters. If he says whoopee, it's all caps and it goes for a line. The great master of this, of course, the great innovator in what we call modernism as a rubric, is James Joyce. And there's a good deal of Joycean wordplay here, or sort of oral association. In part, I think, as you tellingly remind us, because a lot of this happened in the dark. It was what he heard, not what he saw. So between those two sort of constrictions, that A, he was trying to draw it, and B, he was trying to hear it, this book is a very immediate evocation of what is by now the long distant past. It's a present tense report about what we've been describing as a historical event. And you have to be with them in the room.
Well, they take you there. I mean, the other thing about it is Joyce is one of his big influences, and then there's the Ghost of Pound. And
right, absolutely.
One of Cummings's big ideas, or it wasn't Cummings's idea, it was Pound's idea, or it was the Chinese philosopher, it was Confucius's idea, I gather, is make it new. And certainly the way that you make life in prison new is you say, oh, what could be better? This is so much fun. And I love another thing that Cummings does, which is not modernist, but really old fashioned, is to people the prison with a series of astonishing characters. My favorite being the guy whose job is painting Cornelius Vanderbilt's horse portraits, right? Like that's a full-time job, Count Bragard, right? This is what this guy, Cornelius Vanderbilt, has a man who does big oil paintings of his horses. So, but there are wonderful, wonderful characters in this prison, and Cummings, is delighted by them and wants you to be delighted by them too. It's the freshness of his vision. And in your introduction, one of the things you said, you linked it to Cubism, which I think is brilliant. And that was the whole idea. It's a new way of seeing the world. There's the old way, and this is a new way. And with Cubism, as you say, it's the difference between the line and the plane, right? And so I feel that Cummings is striving to do that in language, as you point out, to make it new, to make it different, to force you to see the world in a new way. And as I often say, puts my students right to sleep, what I want as a writer is I want you to look up from the last page of my book and see the world in a new way. And that, I think, is exactly what Cummings is up to here. And it works beautifully.
One of his most famous lines of poetry, I imagine is familiar to many who are in this soi-disant conversation, is, since feeling is all, who pays any attention to the syntax of things? And the syntax of things here is really ripped apart and reconstituted. I mean, we have to be honest about this. The book from time to time is hard to read, if not hard to follow. And as you say, he makes you work to enter into that world and to become a part of it. But the syntax of things has much more to do with feeling than it does with the sequential, this happened and then that happened and then that happened, and these are the conclusions we should draw. The emphasis throughout is on, what he took away with him from this wholly unexpected gift that others would call a debt. I'm inclined to read, only by way of trying to make this point a little clearer, what he says in the very end, the literal closing of the text. And the definition of happiness, I most certainly do not intend to attempt, but I can and will say this: to leave la misère, the misery, with the knowledge, and worse than that, the feeling that some of the finest people in the world are doomed to remain prisoners thereof for no one knows how long, and doomed to continue possibly for years and tens of years and all the years which terribly are between them and their deaths. The gray and indivisible non-existence which without apology you're quitting for reality, cannot by any stretch of the imagination be concerned as constituting a happy ending to a great and personal adventure. That I write this chapter at all is that purely and simply to the, I dare, might say, unjustified hope on my part that by recording certain events, it may haul a little additional light into a very tremendous darkness. I think this book does that. It hauls a little additional light into a very tremendous darkness. I have the sense that we've talked to each other and with each other enough so that we should perhaps entertain questions now, because we're tilting towards completion. And that's sort of why I dared give his last word.
Great.
Yeah, well, thank you for reading that and for this conversation so far. It's been such a pleasure to listen to, if I may speak on behalf of the rest of the audience. We do have some questions so far. Those of you at home, please do keep submitting your questions. You can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Our first one is from V. Joshua Adams. It's something we've talked about a little bit, but maybe we could elaborate on. 1922 is a big year for modernist centenaries. I think we're talking about Joyce here. Where do you see the enormous room, if you do, fitting into that movement? Could we talk a little more about the enormous room or Cummings in general in modernism and other literature from the 1920s? Does it have the same features or ambitions? Again, I think we've talked about it a little, but maybe both of you could elaborate on that.
Yeah.
You can go first.
All right.
It's a hard, complicated question. I've forgotten the name of the person who submitted it, but
it is a complicated question, and it's a larger subject than we can hope to circumscribe in the few remaining minutes here. One of the things that strikes me, I'm not yet a centenarian, but have been around a goodly while, and it did shock me, which is why I kind of wanted to undertake this project, to recognize that this book is 100 years old. Indeed, most of what we construe to be the classic texts of modernism, whether it be the Joyce that we've mentioned, or the Proust, or the Mann, or slightly more esoteric figures like Kafka, and I mean, the list is too long to too much. They were very long ago. That has become our root rather than our forward-facing root, as in R-O-O-T rather than R-O-U-T-E. Our root condition, way of looking at the world, to repeat what Susan said and what Pound famously said, make it new. That injunction, that imperative, is also about 100 years old, and we're still attempting to honor it, as he was honoring Confucius, who was several centuries previous, several millennia previous. What am I trying to say? Modernism by now has been so thoroughly established, is so much the root of our tradition, that it's hard to remember the shock of the new that it once engendered. The sense of people saying, what the hell is this? And why should I allow this assault on the standard exposition with which I'm familiar and which I was taught at such a school as you fled? I'm trying to say that what Cummings did here, as he did with his poetry, which was an independent venture, in fact, surprisingly little followed. There isn't anybody else I know that has made such a fuss about the size of the punctuation, what should be capital letters, what should be, there are few followers, but he did much more to change syntax and line breaks than he did to change punctuation. Still, when he did it, people said, what the hell is going on with this guy? Can't he afford a proper printer? And by now we take it almost for granted because it has been proven to be an enduring text. End of speech, beginning of your turn.
Yeah, it's, yes, indeed, modernism is a very old thing now. But my students keep rediscovering it. And I find myself almost every semester with a student to whom I have to say, aha, you are a modernist. You are somebody who's trying to make meaning through sound rather than sense. You don't care about the content of your essay. You want to communicate with the reader through the sounds. And this seems to be a sort of human urge. And if you look at like Maggie Nelson, I mean, there are a lot of writers, Jenny Booley, there are a lot of writers, young writers who are doing this, who my students find and emulate. So I think it's certainly the sound and sense idea is keeps getting renewed. Some of the other, I'm not sure that all literature keeps getting renewed. In other words, can we go back to the idea that the artist has to be separated from the art? I don't know. In other words, there may be some bridges that you cross and then it's burned behind you, and there may be other bridges, but it seems to me that a lot of the tenets of modernism, certainly the Cummings's idea that he could communicate with you through sound instead of sense, keeps coming back. And of course, his idea that everything syntactical or hierarchical or old should be thrown out ipso facto, right? And that he should not only make it new, but everything should be new. My students love that. Who wouldn't love that?
Yeah.
And so in a way, the difficulty part, they don't like so much. In other words, but I think there's a part of modernism that really is as alive today as it was in 1930.
Let me play literature professor also for a moment and repeat that line, since feeling is all who pays any attention to the syntax of things. Syntax, as all grammarians busily remind us, and we all had to learn in one way or another, is the art of subjugation, by which I mean a sentence tells you in its proper structure what is the noun, what is the subordinate clause, what relation to that the verb has, where its apposite clauses are. You should be able to break all sentences down according to what's the most important component of it, what's the secondary, what's the tertiary, et cetera, et cetera. So if syntax is built around the idea that everything has its role in a hierarchy, there's something called parataxis, which, as the name suggests, is about the parallel structure rather than the subordinate structure. Hemingway understood this, though maybe not in quite such formal terms. His standard conjunction was and. So everything is sort of parallel, as in parataxis, rather than this follows that and that belongs to this. What happens in the enormous room is a paratactic structure, by which I mean that it's all happening at once. You never really know, though there's a little bit of chronology alluded to, you never really know which month or which week or which day of his incarceration is the one he's talking about. It's all lumped together. It's happening in a perpetual sort of muddle and shared space. And it's what you've just been talking about sound emerging almost without echo. And that's a very modern concept. I mean, to be, again, formal about it, it has much more to do with what we call metafiction and self-reflexive fiction, where the book returns to itself and repeats its own structures internally rather than indicating to you how to get out of this maze or how to proceed with this. As you've said, there may be nothing new under the sun. Lawrence Sterne did that in the 18th century with a remarkable novel called Tristram Shandy, which is at least as modern as anything we're producing these days. But still, Cummings belongs very thoroughly and entirely to that gang.
I think that was a very thorough answer, and I loved both kind of talked about the shock of the new. And I think that's something that's coming up in the questions as well. First of all, Sarah De La Genti weighs in just to share a memory of discovering Cummings at age 16, saying that it was an epiphany. I always loved poetry. I write poetry. Discovering Cummings was rediscovering language, what one could do with language, how one could look at the world through language, which I think is a very nice memory. And it brings up Jeff Neal's question as well, which is how was The Enormous Room greeted initially upon publication by critics and by the public? What was the shock of the new like to the reading audience at the time?
Well, Nick, you do a great job with that. He's got to read the introduction because that's a really good question. The answer is
not well. People didn't really want to lambaste the book because, after all, Cummings had gone to Harvard and his daddy was an important public presence. But the reviews as such were sort of, ho-hum if we have to. And forgive me, I'm turning on a light so that I can see not what I wrote, but what others wrote about it.
it got panned.
Here's a small sampling from the New York Times, May 29, 1922. No doubt the author of The Enormous Room sincerely believes himself a realist and would claim as sincerely to have written what he saw and heard exactly as it was, as certainly he's done nothing of the kind. One from the New York Herald of May 22. This is an uncanny book. One puts it down with a feeling of nausea, which is doubtless according to the writer's intent, but also with a strong conviction that it is a book which never should have been printed. It serves no purpose except to disgust. There were 2 or 3 marginally more generous reactions, but by and large, it was enough to turn the young man's fancy to poetry.
Wow. Well,
I think it would be fun to say a little bit about the background of The Enormous Room. When Cummings got back from France, his father, who, as you say, was a man of some substance, a friend of presidents, but a minister, blah, 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 Harvard professor, blah, 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 his father had essentially gotten him sprung. And he was so furious that his father decided to sue the United States government for the way they had treated his son. Cummings was like, they treated me great, I loved it. But his father carried all that anger and rage and said to his son, I'm going to sue the United States government, I'm going to sue the French government, I'm going to get these, they're going to pay for this, blah, 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 blah. And Cummings said to him, well, how about I write a book instead? So in many ways, The Enormous Room was instead of, I think of him as Mr. Cummings, instead of Edward Cummings's lawsuits. And in fact, his father paid him to write it because it was instead of the lawsuits that his father wanted to bring on his behalf. So, and Cummings, I think his father, I think they made this deal in 1920. So Cummings took the money and went to Southeast Asia and did everything else he could possibly think of to do before finally coming home in the summer of 22, corralling poor Slater Brown and saying, come on, get in the tent and tell me everything you remember. So, but it was very much, it was a project born of outrage and kind of patriarchal fury. And of course, Cummings is the opposite of the furious patriarch. And so that interests me, that he was able to really, there's nothing of Edward Cummings in it.
Exactly right. I do think that it caught the eye of his soon-to-be close companions, people like Marianne Moore and Ezra Pound and many others who we construe to be major modernists recognized that this young man had a particular sensibility and a special way of looking at and then rendering the world in words. So it wasn't a failure in that sense, but compared to, say, the enormous éclat, I revert to it again, of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, which in a way is about having been imprisoned in a hospital room. It had none of the public enchantments, in part because it was, as you've wonderfully made clear, just harder to read.
Right.
And good. Right. Susan, do you want to talk about the other thing the other memory that you mentioned about the elevator and the hat?
Oh,
I think that would be a lovely way to close.
I'd love to tell that story. As I said, I was raised in a household where Cummings was a kind of mythical figure. And one of my father's favorite stories about Cummings was that Cummings he had two very difficult marriages, and then he ended up with a woman named Marion Morehouse, who was famously so beautiful that photographers flocked to take her picture. And she was also very sweet. And they were very happy together, but they had no money. They lived in Patchen Place in the West Village in a kind of falling down little house. And actually they rented different pieces of it. And so one New Year's Eve, they had been invited to a very fancy party way uptown on, say, 85th Street. And they weren't sure how they were going to get there, but Marion put on a gown that, had been made for her at Worth. And Cummings put on his white tie and tails and his collapsible top hat and his patent leather dancing shoes. And off they went to this fancy party. They found in the sofa cushions, they found 2 subway tokens. So they got on the subway and got up to 85th Street to this incredibly fancy party at, let's say, Mrs. Astor's. And they had a wonderful time at the party. They didn't think twice about it. They drank, they danced, they did what one does at wonderful New Year's Eve parties. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, it was time to go home. And they still had no way to get home. And they got in the elevator, and then the elevator door was about to close, and somebody's arm came through, and it was a banker with a, big banker's face, and his wife, his obedient little wife. And they got in the elevator, and the banker said to Cummings, what a lovely top hat. And Cummings said, well, would you like to step on it? And the banker said, of course, they're all so drunk. The banker said, yes, I would. And so Cummings puts his top hat on the floor. The banker steps on the top hat, and Cummings says, that'll be $20. And the banker gives the $20 bill, and they take a taxi home. So that idea that the world will take care of you if you let it, it's such a wonderful idea. And it was so much part of the way that Cummings lived. I mean, there's so many wonderful Cummings stories. Oh my goodness. But he just, I in your introduction, you say that he got old and cranky, but the night that he changed my life was only 3 years before he died. So and even his final moment, he says to his wife, they're at the Cummings farm on Silver Lake, and his wife says, dinner's ready, and he says, I'll be right there, I just want to sharpen the axe. And he dies. Wow. So what a way to live. And what incredible, he also was he would stand on his head to amuse you. In the details, my cousins remember that he always tied his shoes backwards, with the bow at the bottom of the lacing. I mean, anything he could do that was non-syntactical, so to speak, he would do.
What a great story. I think that really illuminates who he was as a person so well, and the energy of the book, which I think we have time for one more question, and it sort of brings us back as well to the question of the context of the novel and Cummings' father's anger. We have a question from Eric Limesider, who asks, does the book express a deep depression or anger at being imprisoned, as well as, or rather than, or deeper than the madcap hilarity, which expresses a refusal to admit to the depression or anger. So is there sort of an ambivalence in the text, or is it purely madcap hilarity?
That's an interesting question.
I would like to say that the book expresses none of that, the hilarity or the madcap. We may be slightly overstating it, but the good humor predominates. What is dark and what is deep and what is enduring about the portrait that he paints is the surround, the people there, the less fortunate than he, who are almost the entire population of Le Ferte-Massé. He discovers in himself and proves to himself a deep affinity with the downtrodden of the earth. And that is by no means a kind of a young man's heel-clicking hilarity. It's a book about how these folk are consigned to a kind of unfair perdition.
Well, I agree. I mean, Cummings is the, he's the poet of the little guy. He, the idea that most of the people at the dépôt de triage or La Ferté-Massé are there by mistake and will probably be there for decades by mistake, makes him furious. But he identifies with them, and it's one of the really interesting things about him. I mean, he was brought up in a great big house on Irving Street in Cambridge, maybe a little too close to Somerville, but not that close. And, he somehow is the guy who's always wondering about the person in the street or the other people. So I don't sense any personal depression in him. But I also think there's no, I was trying to think of what is the opposite of trauma today, because I was thinking that's what Cummings has. It's a traumatic situation, and he embraces it with whatever is the opposite. And that's really how he went through the world. Some terrible things happened to him. And some terrible things happened to him, but he met them with tremendous buoyancy. But also the dark part is what happens to other people. And also he hated bureaucracy. He hated that whole hierarchical, patriarchal, whatever we're going to call it, really hated it. And wrote against it as much as he could. There's a wonderful poem at the end about he catches a mouse, and he even is on the side of the mouse who he's caught in his kitchen. So I guess the answer is maybe.
I think maybe is a great note to end on. Also, I think we have a new subtitle for the book, The Opposite of Trauma. That's fabulous. Thank you both for this really wonderful conversation. It's been engaging and fun and enlightening. Those of you at home, please consider purchasing a copy of The Enormous Room from Community Bookstore. And we hope to see you at another virtual event really soon. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great evening, everyone.
Good night, and thank you.
All right, thanks, Noah.
Take care.